Across forests, rivers, and frozen frontiers, a vast land slowly came under imperial control. What began as rival European claims turned into a long chapter of British rule that reshaped Canada forever. Battles were fought. Treaties were signed. And new laws were imposed. At the same time, communities adapted, resisted, and survived. This is the story of Canada under British rule. A story of conquest, compromise, and transformation. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for taking this time to explore history together. Canada's past under British rule is not a simple story of victory or progress. It is a layered history of empire, Indigenous displacement, settler growth, and political change. Did British rule create Canada as it exists today, or did it permanently divide the land and its peoples? Long before imperial flags were raised over northern forests and river valleys, the land that would later be called Canada was already alive with order and meaning. Vast territories were home to many indigenous nations, each with its own language, laws, and ways of understanding the world. These societies were not scattered or chaotic. They were structured, adaptive, and deeply connected to the land they inhabited. Communities governed themselves through councils, kinship networks, and systems of responsibility shaped over generations. Leadership was earned through wisdom, experience, and trust. Decisions were guided by tradition, diplomacy, and spiritual belief. Trade routes crossed immense distances, linking peoples across forests, plains, and waterways. Knowledge of seasons, animals, and landforms allowed societies to thrive in environments that outsiders would later struggle to survive. Rivers served as highways rather than barriers. The St. Lawrence River in particular was a central artery, connecting inland nations to the Atlantic world long before Europeans arrived. Along its banks, life followed rhythms set by climate, ceremony, and shared memory. The land was not owned in the European sense, but respected as a living presence that sustained all. The early 17th century brought new visitors from across the ocean. French explorers and settlers arrived seeking trade, influence, and opportunity. They established small but strategic colonies along the St. Lawrence River, creating footholds that would anchor their presence in North America. These settlements were fragile at first, dependent on cooperation with indigenous nations for survival, trade, and guidance. French colonial life developed around alliances rather than conquest. Fur trading became the backbone of their expansion, tying European markets to indigenous expertise and labor. Relationships were negotiated through diplomacy, marriage, and mutual interest. For a time, this balance allowed French colonies to endure despite limited population and harsh conditions. Across the continent, another power was watching closely. Britain, already expanding its influence along the Atlantic coast, viewed French presence as both a rival and a threat. The struggle for North America was not only about land, but about trade routes, naval dominance, and imperial prestige. Slowly, competition hardened into confrontation. For more than a century, French and British interests collided across forests, rivers, and fortresses. Skirmishes flared, treaties were signed, then broken. Indigenous nations were drawn into these struggles, sometimes as allies, sometimes as targets, always as crucial participants. Their choices shaped the balance of power, though their autonomy was increasingly constrained by European rivalry. Settlements expanded cautiously, protected by forts and defended by soldiers who often knew little of the terrain they occupied. Winter, distance, and supply shortages tested every colonial ambition. Yet neither empire was willing to retreat. Control of the region promised access to resources, influence over trade, and strategic advantage in global conflict. As decades passed, the scale of rivalry grew. European wars spilled into North America, turning colonial disputes into extensions of distant struggles. What happened along the St. Lawrence or in the Great Lakes region was connected to battles fought across the Atlantic. The fate of communities in the wilderness became linked to decisions made in royal courts thousands of miles away. As decades passed, the scale of rivalry grew. The turning point came through war rather than negotiation. Military campaigns intensified, and the continent became a theater of empire. Armies marched through unfamiliar landscapes. Alliances shifted under pressure. Victory would not come easily, and defeat would reshape the future of the land. For indigenous nations, this period was one of uncertainty and resilience. They navigated alliances carefully, seeking to preserve autonomy amid expanding foreign power. Yet the nature of the struggle made neutrality nearly impossible. As empires fought for dominance, the space for indigenous self-rule narrowed. By the mid-18th century, the balance tipped decisively. British forces gained the upper hand, and French control began to collapse. The outcome was not simply a change of rulers. It marked a transition toward a new imperial order, one that would bring deeper settlement, stricter administration, and a different vision for the land. Canada's future was decided not in a single moment, but through generations of encounter, competition, and conflict. Before British control was established, the region had already been shaped by ancient societies and imperial rivalry. What followed would build upon these foundations, transforming them in ways that still echo across the landscape today. The story of this era is one of beginnings rather than conclusions. It reveals a land already rich with history before empire arrived. And a struggle that set the stage for everything that came after. In the middle of the 18th century, the balance of power in North America stood on uncertain ground. Vast forests, winding rivers, and fortified towns formed a contested world where empires tested their strength. Britain and France had spent decades competing for influence, building alliances, and claiming territory. But the struggle was far from settled. That uncertainty would be resolved in a short and decisive burst of conflict. The wider war was global, stretching from Europe to the Caribbean and into Asia. In North America, it became a battle for control of land, trade routes, and political influence. French forces relied on a network of rivers and forts, supported by long-standing relationships with indigenous nations. British leaders, alarmed by French expansion, prepared for a final confrontation that would determine the continent's future. The year 1759 emerged as the defining moment. British commanders targeted the heart of French power along the St. Lawrence River. The city of Quebec rose above the water on high cliffs, protected by natural defenses and military works. It was considered nearly impossible to capture. Yet British forces pressed forward, determined to break French resistance. The campaign unfolded with tension and uncertainty. Troops maneuvered through unfamiliar terrain, supplies moved slowly. And weather tested endurance. Both sides understood what was at stake. Victory would mean dominance in North America. Defeat would mean retreat and loss. When the decisive battle came, it was swift and brutal. Fought on ground that would soon enter history. The British victory at Quebec shattered French confidence. Though fighting continued elsewhere, the psychological impact was immense. French strongholds weakened, and British forces advanced with growing assurance. Control of key positions along rivers and trade routes followed, tightening Britannia's grip on the region. The war dragged on for several more years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. By 1763, diplomacy replaced battlefield struggle. France, facing pressure across multiple fronts, agreed to surrender most of its North American territories. The agreement transferred vast lands to British control, reshaping the map of the continent. With this transfer, Canada came under British rule. The change was profound. A region long governed by French law, language, and custom now faced a new imperial authority. British officials arrived to administer territories where the population remained largely French-speaking and deeply rooted in their traditions. This moment marked not just a military victory, but the beginning of a complex political challenge. Daily life in Canada did not transform overnight. Farms continued to operate, churches remained central to community life, and local customs endured. Yet beneath this continuity, authority had shifted. New laws, officials, and expectations slowly began to shape governance. British rule introduced unfamiliar systems, even as it sought to avoid provoking resistance. The conquest also altered relationships with indigenous nations. Alliances built under French rule were disrupted, and British policies followed different priorities. Some communities adapted, while others viewed the change with suspicion. The balance of power shifted once again, creating uncertainty across the interior. For Britain, the victory brought both opportunity and burden. The empire now controlled enormous territories, but maintaining them required resources and careful management. Decisions made in the aftermath of conquest would echo far beyond Canada, influencing policies across the Atlantic world. The years following 1763 revealed the deeper consequences of conquest. British confidence grew, reinforced by success on the battlefield. Yet governing diverse populations tested imperial assumptions. Questions of loyalty, identity, and rights emerged, shaping debates that would later transform the empire itself. The British conquest of Canada was not merely an endpoint. It was a beginning. It signaled the rise of British dominance in North America, while setting the stage for new tensions. The transfer of power created a society layered with memory, where French heritage persisted under British authority. This period stands as a turning point because it combined decisive action with lasting complexity. Military triumph delivered control, but governance demanded adaptation. Britain gained a continent, yet inherited its histories, cultures, and challenges. From 1759 to 1763, the fate of North America was decided in battles and treaties. But its future was shaped in quieter moments that followed. The conquest transformed empires and communities alike, leaving a legacy that would influence generations. What appeared as a clear victory on the map became, in reality, the beginning of a long and intricate chapter in imperial rule. In the aftermath of war and rapid expansion, the British Empire faced a growing problem in North America. Settlers moved westward with growing confidence, while indigenous nations defended lands that had never been surrendered. Tension spread across forests, rivers, and newly drawn maps. The frontier was restless. In this uncertain moment, Britain issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It was presented as an attempt to bring order to a fractured landscape. Authority would be clarified. Boundaries would be defined. Conflict, it was hoped, could be restrained before it grew into something unmanageable. The proclamation established British governance over newly acquired territories. It confirmed the Crown as the ultimate authority in North America, reinforcing imperial control after years of war. Governors were empowered. Colonial administration was formalized. Yet the document also contained an unusual recognition. Indigenous land rights were acknowledged in theory. Vast regions west of the Appalachian Mountains were designated as indigenous territory. Settlement in these areas was restricted. Only the Crown, not individual settlers or colonies, could negotiate land purchases from indigenous nations. The proclamation implied that order could only be maintained through regulated expansion rather than uncontrolled settlement. The stated aim was stability. By limiting westward movement, British officials hoped to reduce violence on the frontier. Fewer settlers crossing into contested territories meant fewer confrontations. Regulated land acquisition would, in theory, prevent unauthorized seizures and reduce resentment on all sides. From London, the policy appeared logical. Imperial planners believed a clear boundary could hold back the tide of expansion. Law would replace chaos. Authority would flow downward from the crown, shaping behavior across distant colonies. But the reality on the ground was very different. Settlers already view the frontier as a place of opportunity. Land meant independence, wealth, and security for future generations. Many had fought in the recent war and believed expansion was a reward they had earned. Colonial officials often lacked the power or willingness to enforce the proclamation. Local economies depended on growth. Speculators ignored restrictions. Maps were redrawn quietly. Paths became roads. In practice, the proclamation was often ignored. Settlers pushed westward despite official policy. Squatters cleared land. Farms took root. Once established, these communities were difficult to remove. The boundary envisioned in distant offices dissolved into a shifting frontier shaped by persistence rather than law. For indigenous nations, the promise of protection proved fragile. While the proclamation recognized land rights in theory, enforcement was inconsistent at best. Complaints traveled slowly. Decisions were delayed. Meanwhile, encroachment continued, changing the landscape before any response could arrive. This gap between principle and practice revealed a deeper contradiction. The empire sought both control and expansion. The proclamation tried to balance these opposing forces, but the momentum of settlement was stronger than restraint. Authority weakened as distance increased. Over time, the document took on different meanings for different groups. To imperial officials, it was a tool of governance. To settlers, it was an obstacle to ambition. To indigenous nations, it became a rare written acknowledgement that their land rights existed at all. As years passed, the proclamation faded from everyday enforcement, but it did not disappear. Its language endured in legal memory. Long after boundaries shifted and settlements expanded, the recognition it contained remained recorded in imperial law. Centuries later, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 would still influence indigenous land claims. Courts and governments would return to its text, not as a solution to the past, but as evidence of early acknowledgement. The document became a point of reference in debates over sovereignty, treaties, and responsibility. It showed that indigenous land rights had once been formally recognized, even if imperfectly applied. That recognition could not be easily erased from the historical record. The proclamation stands today as a symbol of both restraint and failure. It represents an attempt to impose order on expansion, and the inability of empire to control its own settlers. It reveals how law can acknowledge rights while lacking the power or will to defend them. Its legacy is therefore complex. It neither stopped settlement nor prevented conflict. Yet it created a lasting legal footprint. A moment when the empire paused, defined a boundary, and admitted, however briefly, that the land was not empty. And though ignored in its own time, its influence continues to shape conversations about land, authority, and justice today. When Britain emerged victorious from the long struggle with France in North America, it inherited more than territory. It inherited a people with a distinct language, faith, and legal tradition. In the lands along the St. Lawrence River, French-Canadian society had taken deep root over generations. Farms, parishes, and towns followed rhythms shaped by Catholic belief and French civil law. British rule now stood over this world, faced with a delicate and uncertain task. Unlike many other colonies, this population could not be easily replaced or ignored. They were numerous, organized, and closely tied to their land. They were not recent arrivals but a settled society with its own institutions and leaders. Any attempt to rule by force alone risked instability, resistance, and long-term disorder. British officials understood that control required something more flexible. In the years following the transfer of power, uncertainty filled daily life. British governors represented a distant empire, speaking a different language and guided by unfamiliar customs. The memory of conflict was still fresh, and trust was fragile. Rather than impose immediate assimilation, Britain chose a path of adaptation. Local customs were tolerated. The Catholic Church was allowed to continue its role in education, community life, and moral authority. French civil law, which governed property, family relations, and inheritance, remained in use. This decision was unusual within the British Empire, where uniformity was often the goal. These choices were not made out of generosity alone. They were calculated acts of governance. Stability mattered more than cultural conformity. These choices were calculated to minimize the risk of rebellion. By preserving the status quo, the empire ensured its own survival. This approach took formal shape in the Quebec Act of 1774. The act confirmed the rights of French Canadians to practice their religion freely and to use their traditional legal system in civil matters. It also expanded the boundaries of the province, strengthening British control over the interior. For French Canadians, the act offered reassurance. Their way of life would not be swept away overnight. Yet this decision carried consequences beyond Canada. British settlers in other colonies, especially to the south, viewed the act with suspicion and anger. They saw it as favoritism and feared the spread of Catholic influence. To them, the preservation of French language and religion felt like a betrayal of British values. Tensions rose as different visions of empire collided. Within Canada, the effect was more calming. By protecting key aspects of identity, Britain avoided immediate rebellion. French Canadian leaders found space to cooperate with colonial authorities, even if loyalty to the crown remained cautious rather than enthusiastic. Daily life continued with fewer disruptions than many had expected. This arrangement revealed an important truth about empire. British rule was not always rigid. When resistance seemed likely, it could bend. Adaptation became a tool of survival for imperial power. In Canada, compromise proved more effective than coercion. Over time, this balance shaped a distinct colonial society. British political authority sat alongside French cultural continuity. Churches rang their bells. Courts applied familiar principles. Villages maintained traditions that connected past and present. The colony did not become fully British, nor did it remain untouched by imperial influence. Instead, it evolved into something layered and complex. This complexity influenced loyalty during moments of crisis. When rebellion broke out in the 13 colonies, many French Canadians chose not to join. The protections they had been granted reduced the appeal of revolt. Britain's strategy, though controversial elsewhere, achieved its immediate aim in Canada. Still, tension never fully disappeared. British officials remained wary of difference. French Canadians remained aware of their vulnerable position within an empire that could change its policies at any time. The peace that followed was cautious, maintained through mutual calculation rather than deep trust. The legacy of this period extended far beyond the 18th century. It shaped the foundations of modern Canada, where dual legal traditions and cultural identities continue to coexist. The choices made under British rule left a lasting imprint on language, religion, and governance. French Canada under British rule stands as a reminder that empires often survive not only through force, but through selective tolerance. When domination threatened instability, adaptation offered another path. In this case, compromise preserved order, reshaped identity, and allowed a distinct society to endure within a global empire. The story is one of quiet negotiation rather than open conflict. It shows how power can adjust its shape when circumstances demand it. And it reveals how survival, for both ruler and ruled, sometimes depends on the willingness to bend rather than break. In the final decades of the 18th century, a conflict to the south sent quiet shockwaves across the northern frontier. Between 1775 and 1783, the American Revolution transformed the political map of North America. 13 colonies broke away from British rule, ending an era of imperial control that had seemed permanent only a generation earlier. While the fighting raged in towns and fields far away, the consequences reached deep into Canada. For Britain, the loss was profound. The American colonies had been central to imperial power, trade, and identity. Their separation forced British leaders to rethink strategy and security in the remaining territories. Canada, once a secondary possession, suddenly gained new importance. It became a refuge, a defensive buffer, and a place where loyalty to the crown still defined political life. As the war drew toward its end, thousands of people faced a difficult choice. In the former colonies, allegiance to Britain became dangerous. Families who had supported imperial rule, served in loyalist militias, or depended on British administration found themselves isolated and threatened. Many chose to leave rather than adapt to the new republic. Their destination lay to the north. The Loyalist migration into British Canada was one of the most significant population movements in the region's early history. Entire households packed what they could carry and traveled by road, river, and sea. Some arrived by ship along the Atlantic coast, while others moved through forests and waterways into the interior. They came not as conquerors, but as displaced people seeking stability under familiar authority. These newcomers brought with them strong expectations. They believed that loyalty deserved reward. And the British government largely agreed. Land grants were issued to help loyalists rebuild their lives. New settlements appeared along rivers and coastlines, often carved quickly out of wooded terrain. In these spaces, loyalist communities recreated patterns they had known before the war. With them came British laws and customs. The Loyalists valued legal traditions rooted in monarchy and parliament. They expected courts, orderly administration, and clear property rights. Their presence strengthened British influence in Canada at a moment when it might otherwise have weakened. In many ways, they reinforced the idea that Canada would remain distinct from its Republican neighbour. The demographic impact was immediate. Regions that had once been sparsely populated saw sudden growth. The Loyalists altered the balance between older French-speaking communities, indigenous nations, and newer British arrivals. This shift added complexity to an already layered society, forcing colonial administrators to manage competing interests and identities. Politics changed alongside population. Loyalists did not see themselves as passive subjects. Many had experienced representative assemblies in the American colonies and expected similar institutions in Canada. They pressed for local governance, elected bodies, and a voice in decision-making. Their demands reshaped colonial administration, pushing it toward structures that balanced authority with participation. In response, Britain reorganized its northern territories. New provinces were created, boundaries redrawn, and systems adjusted to accommodate Loyalist settlement. These changes laid foundations that would influence Canadian political development for generations. The presence of Loyalists accelerated the growth of English-speaking institutions and legal frameworks across large areas. Yet this transformation was not without cost. Indigenous lands were increasingly encroached upon as Loyalist settlements expanded. Promises made during wartime alliances were often overlooked. In the rush to provide land and security for newcomers, the Loyalist story, while framed around loyalty and sacrifice, became intertwined with broader patterns of displacement already underway. For the Loyalists themselves, the experience was mixed. Some rebuilt prosperous lives, turning cleared land into farms and towns. Others struggled with harsh climates, limited supplies, and isolation. Memories of loss lingered, shaping a collective identity defined by exile and endurance. These memories would be passed down, becoming part of Canada's historical consciousness. By the early 19th century, the effects of the American Revolution had fully settled into Canadian society. The influx of Loyalists had anchored British influence more deeply than before. Canada developed not as an extension of the American experiment, but as a contrasting path, defined by gradual reform rather than sudden revolution. The Loyalist migration helped set this tone, embedding caution, loyalty, and negotiation into political culture. Over time, the Loyalists became symbols within Canadian history. They represented sacrifice for principle and commitment to order in an age of upheaval. Yet they also represented the complexity of empire, where loyalty to one power meant displacement from another place. The American Revolution did more than create a new nation. It reshaped the one beside it. Through the movement of people, ideas, and expectations, Canada was transformed. Its population grew more British in character, its politics more structured, and its role within the empire more secure. The story of Loyalist migration is therefore not just about refugees of war. It is about how conflict redirects lives and redefines nations. In the wake of revolution, Canada was not merely changed. It was remade, quietly and permanently, by those who crossed its borders seeking continuity in a world that had suddenly shifted. In the year 1837, unrest simmered across the colonies of Upper and Lower Canada. Communities that had long lived under the shadow of concentrated power began to speak with renewed urgency. Their demands were grounded in frustration and a vision of fairness, envisioning a system where governance would reflect the will of the people rather than the narrow interests of a few. The landscape of rebellion was varied. In Upper Canada, farmers, merchants, and local leaders gathered to voice discontent. Roads and villages became points of assembly, where ideas were exchanged and plans were quietly made. The tension was palpable, a sense that long-standing grievances could no longer be ignored. In Lower Canada, French-speaking communities brought their own grievances to the fore. Language, culture, and economic pressures shaped a determination to assert local rights and challenge distant authorities. Rebellion, when it came, was swift but uneven. Armed clashes erupted, often in rural areas where government forces were thinly spread. While insurgents showed courage and determination, British troops and Loyalist militias moved decisively to quell the uprisings. Villages that had witnessed the spark of rebellion soon felt the weight of military response. Battles were brief, yet the consequences echoed far beyond the battlefield. Communities faced reprisals, leaders were arrested, and symbols of resistance were suppressed. Despite the failure of the immediate uprisings, the impact of the rebellions could not be dismissed. British authorities recognized that suppression alone would not address underlying tensions. The events revealed systemic weaknesses and highlighted the need for careful reassessment. Administrators in London studied reports, noting the depth of dissatisfaction and the potential for unrest if reform was ignored. The colonies had demonstrated that ordinary people were willing to take action when their voices went unheard. In response, Britain began to explore avenues for structural change. Commissions were sent to investigate the causes of unrest and to recommend solutions that could balance imperial authority with local demands. The goal was to create stability while maintaining British control, a delicate task that required both firmness and foresight. Advisors emphasized the importance of merging administrative systems, reducing friction between communities, and creating a governance model that could respond more effectively to local needs. Creating a governance model that responds to local needs is a delicate task that required both firmness and foresight. The goal was to create stability while maintaining British control, a delicate task that required both firmness and foresight. The culmination of this reflection came in 1840. With the Act of Union, Upper and Lower Canada were brought together into a single political entity, a unified colony, with a new structure designed to streamline administration, to reduce conflict, integrate economic and legal systems, and provide a foundation for gradual reform. While the merger was not a solution to every grievance, it marked a significant shift in the approach to colonial governance. Authority was now more centralized. Yet mechanisms for consultation and representation began to take shape. Acknowledging the lessons learned from the rebellions, communities adjusted to new administrative procedures and legal frameworks. Towns and villages that had once operated under divided systems now faced coordination across broader jurisdictions. Officials, judges, and legislators worked to implement the changes, while residents observed the slow transformation of governance around them. The rebellions of 1837 and the subsequent Act of Union also had a cultural impact. People learned that expressing demands carried risks but also prompted attention from those in power. Ideas about representation, fairness, and civic responsibility gained traction, influencing how citizens understood their place within the political system. The British response combined suppression with strategic adaptation, illustrating the challenge of maintaining control while addressing legitimate grievances. The rebellions were both a warning and a catalyst, showing that authority depended not only on force but also on the ability to listen, adjust, and implement meaningful change. Responsible government, representation, and accountability were no longer abstract concepts. They were principles that influenced administrative choices, legal reforms, and the everyday experience of communities. The Union created a framework in which these principles could gradually take root, even as the legacy of tension and resistance lingered in memory. Rebellion had exposed the limits of authority and highlighted the need for adaptation. In the years that followed, the lessons of this period resonated across the colony. Leaders, settlers, and communities alike carried the memory of unrest and the hope for more inclusive governance, creating a foundation for a more balanced and responsive system. By 1848, Canada stood at the edge of transformation. The land that had long been governed by distant officials in London was beginning to experience a shift in how power flowed. For decades, governors appointed by Britain had controlled colonial administration with limited input from local inhabitants. Decisions about taxation, infrastructure, and lawmaking were made far away, leaving residents with little influence over their own communities. In that year, Britain introduced responsible government in Canada. This reform marked a turning point, redefining the relationship between colony and empire. Local elected leaders were granted real political authority, able to shape legislation and oversee administration in ways that had previously been the sole domain of appointed governors. Authority became more immediate, more responsive, and more connected to the needs of the people it affected. The change did not mean independence. Britain retained control over foreign policy, military decisions, and the ultimate approval of legislation. The Crown still stood above the colonial assembly, a reminder of the Empire's enduring presence. Yet day-to-day governance shifted decisively into local hands. Ministers responsible to elected assemblies now carried real responsibility for the administration of schools, roads, trade, and public order. This shift transformed the experience of power in Canada. Residents could now see the effects of their votes reflected in the policies that shaped daily life. Councils debated local issues, ministers answered to assemblies, and accountability became tangible. Government was no longer a distant abstraction, it was present, accessible, and shaped by the communities it served. The introduction of responsible government also altered political culture. Debate became more vigorous, alliances more strategic, and negotiation more necessary. Elected leaders balanced the interests of diverse populations, including farmers, merchants, and emerging urban centers. Policies were contested in assembly halls, newspapers, and public meetings, creating a sense of participation that had been largely absent before. For the empire, the reform represented a new approach to colonial administration. Britain recognized that stability could be strengthened by giving colonies more autonomy in internal affairs. The policy reduced friction between local populations and imperial authorities, while still maintaining ultimate imperial oversight. It was a delicate balance between control and concession, reflecting a growing awareness of the limits of direct governance across vast distances. The practical effects of responsible government became apparent quickly. Decisions about taxation, infrastructure development, and local services were now shaped by those who understood the immediate context. The administration felt more grounded, more capable of responding to challenges unique to Canadian society. Socially, the reform fostered engagement and expectation. Voting, once largely ceremonial, now carried weight. Communities organized to support candidates, discuss policies, and advocate for their interests. Public life expanded beyond mere survival to active involvement in shaping the future of the colony. The introduction of responsible government also set a precedent for other colonies. Canada became an example of how the empire could grant internal autonomy while retaining overarching authority. It demonstrated that self-rule and imperial connection were not mutually exclusive. Other territories observed these developments closely, seeing both opportunity and challenge in adopting similar arrangements. In the decades that followed, responsible government helped lay the foundation for the emergence of Canadian identity. Political institutions rooted in local decision-making allowed for experimentation, adaptation, and growth. The colony developed practices, norms, and traditions that reflected its unique geography, economy, and society. At the same time, it remained tied to Britain, balancing loyalty with self-determination. The reform was not without tension. Governors and ministers had to navigate the complexities of divided authority. Disagreements between elected assemblies and imperial officials occasionally flared. Yet the system provided mechanisms for negotiation and compromise, creating a more resilient and adaptable form of governance than had previously existed. Ultimately, responsible government in 1848 represented more than a policy change. It marked a shift in the philosophy of empire. Power could be shared without relinquishing ultimate authority. Governance could be local without dissolving imperial unity. Canada's experience showed that colonies could exercise meaningful self-rule while remaining part of a larger political structure. The legacy of this turning point extends far beyond its immediate context. It established principles that would guide future reforms, shaping the evolution of parliamentary democracy and the gradual emergence of nationhood. By granting real political power to local leaders, Britain allowed Canada to begin a journey towards self-determination. The landscape of governance changed. Institutions matured. And citizens discovered the significance of their participation. While remaining within the empire, Canada learned to govern itself in ways that were responsible and rooted in the needs of its people. The story of responsible government in 1848 is therefore one of transformation, negotiation, and vision. It illustrates how law, policy, and political culture intersect to create lasting change. It reveals a moment when the empire recognized that giving power could strengthen authority, and when a colony began to shape its own destiny while still part of a wider imperial world. In the year 1867, the map of North America shifted once more, this time not through conquest, but through negotiation and political vision. The British North America Act came into force, creating the Dominion of Canada. For Provincias Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia joined together under a single federal structure, forming a new political entity within the British Empire. This was a moment both of continuity and of transformation, a careful balance between imperial authority and local autonomy. For decades, the colonies of British North America had operated under direct colonial administration, subject to governors appointed by London. Local assemblies existed, yet real power remained in the hands of the empire. Tensions occasionally surfaced, as settlers and colonial leaders sought greater control over taxation, trade, and internal policy. The push for confederation was born out of this desire for self-determination, tempered by the need for unity and stability across vast territories. The creation of the Dominion did not sever ties to Britain. Defense and foreign affairs remained under imperial oversight, a reminder that Canada was still part of a global empire. Naval protection, international treaties, and diplomatic relations continued to be guided by London. Yet, within these bounds, Canada gained authority over its internal governance. Legislatures controlled education, transportation, health, and commerce. Provinces could manage local affairs while the federal government coordinated national policy, creating a complex, layered system designed to accommodate diversity and regional interests. Confederation represented more than a legal change. It was a symbolic step toward self-rule. A recognition that the colonies could govern themselves responsibly without constant intervention. Leaders envisioned a country capable of shaping its own future, negotiating its own growth, and responding to challenges with local insight. The new political framework allowed for expansion as well, setting the stage for the inclusion of additional provinces and territories in the decades to come. The transition was gradual, careful, and deliberate. They did not abandon influence, but they allowed Canadian leaders to make decisions on matters affecting everyday life. This careful delegation of power helped maintain stability, reduced friction between local populations and imperial authority, and allowed the new Dominion to develop its own institutions, customs, and political culture. The establishment of Canada as a self-governing dominion also reflected a broader trend within the empire. Britain was increasingly willing to accommodate local autonomy where strategic interests allowed. Confederation became a model for managing colonies that were settled, economically developed, and geographically expansive. It balanced imperial unity with local governance, demonstrating that sovereignty could be shared without undermining authority. Within Canada, the consequences were immediate and profound. Legislatures debated infrastructure projects, railway construction, and settlement policies. Economic planning became more coherent, and political leaders could advocate for the needs of their constituents without waiting for approval from across the Atlantic. This new capacity inspired confidence, encouraged investment, and fostered a sense of national identity distinct from the colonial past. At the same time, Confederation did not resolve every challenge. Indigenous peoples remained largely excluded from political processes. Minority communities faced ongoing struggles for recognition and rights. The Dominion's framework was designed to unite European settler populations first. An inclusion of other groups was uneven and contested. Nevertheless, the structural innovations of 1867 laid the foundation for future legal reforms and gradual expansion of participation. The careful division of powers between federal and provincial authorities allowed Canada to manage its vast geography more effectively, while the central authority coordinated matters of national significance. Trade, taxation, and resource management became more systematic, providing the infrastructure for a growing economy and the governance of an expanding population. Confederation also reshaped perceptions of loyalty and identity. Canadians were still subjects of the British Crown. Yet they experienced new agency in shaping their own communities. The Crown remained a unifying symbol, but the exercise of governance increasingly rested in Canadian hands. This duality defined the character of the Dominion, blending imperial connection with self-determination in a way that would influence political development for generations. As the decades passed, the Dominion of Canada expanded, incorporating additional provinces and territories. Each edition reflected negotiation, compromise, and the gradual assertion of autonomy within a shared imperial framework. The British North America Act of 1867 became the cornerstone of a political experiment that combined continuity with innovation, tradition with change. The creation of the Dominion marked a pivotal moment in the transition from direct colonial rule to self-governance. It demonstrated that authority could be delegated without total loss of control, and that local leadership could coexist with imperial oversight. Canada emerged from this process as a nation capable of managing its own affairs, navigating internal diversity, and participating in the wider empire on its own terms. Confederation and Dominion status did not end Britannia's influence overnight, but they signaled the beginning of a new era. From this moment, Canada could chart its own course, develop its institutions, and cultivate a sense of national identity. The Dominion of 1867 was both a product of British authority and a declaration of Canadian capability. A delicate balance that would shape the country's evolution for decades to come. In 1867, the foundations of modern Canada were laid, blending imperial connection with self-rule. It was a moment of political foresight, careful compromise, and enduring significance, signaling that a colony could grow into a nation while remaining linked to the empire. Confederation became the blueprint for Canada's journey toward full sovereignty. A testament to the power of negotiation, vision, and the gradual exercise of independence within a global context. The story of Canada is inseparable from the long shadow cast by British rule. Over centuries, Britain shaped institutions, laws, and ways of life that continue to define the nation. From bustling cities on the Atlantic coast to remote settlements in the interior, the influence of empire is evident in the architecture, language, and governance that Canadians inherited. Yet alongside these legacies lies a history of displacement, negotiation, and resilience, particularly among Indigenous communities whose lives were profoundly altered. British authority arrived gradually, reinforced through military presence, administrative structures, and settlement policies. Governors oversaw territories. Courts enforced laws derived from English tradition. And officials organized trade and taxation. The structures were designed to maintain control, but they also introduced stability and predictability that settlers relied upon. Towns grew, roads were built, and ports connected inland regions to global markets, creating the framework of a modern society. Parliamentary democracy in Canada can trace its roots directly to British governance. Colonial assemblies emerged as spaces where settlers could voice concerns, pass local regulations, and participate in decision-making. Over time, these institutions evolved into a system that balanced authority with representation, combining inherited traditions with local adaptation. The principles of debate, legislation, and accountability became central to Canadian political culture, shaping how citizens interacted with government for generations to come. The legal system, too, was deeply influenced by British models. Courts followed common law, and legal codes emphasized property rights, and contracts, and procedural fairness. These systems brought order to diverse and rapidly growing populations, while providing mechanisms for dispute resolution and social regulation. Legal traditions helped structure settlements, protect commerce, and define civic responsibilities, ensuring that the empire's authority persisted in everyday life long after the formal exercise of power had ended. Language divisions emerged under British rule, particularly where French and English populations coexisted. Policies aimed at governance, trade, and education often reflected the priorities of the imperial center, sometimes creating tensions between cultural communities. Yet these divisions also produced a uniquely Canadian identity, one shaped by the negotiation of multiple languages, traditions, and allegiances. The coexistence of French and English legal and educational systems became a defining feature of the country's social landscape. At the same time, indigenous communities faced profound disruption. Lands were appropriated for settlement, trade routes were redirected, and traditional governance structures were undermined. Treaties were signed to formalize arrangements, but they were frequently misunderstood, ignored or enforced in ways that disadvantaged indigenous nations. Hunting grounds, fishing areas, and seasonal migration routes were restricted or lost, reshaping lifeways that had endured for generations. The consequences of these changes are still felt today, as indigenous communities continue to navigate the legacies of displacement and cultural disruption. Economic life in Canada also bore the imprint of British rule. Resource extraction, agriculture, and trade were organized according to imperial priorities. Timber, fur, and grain flowed from Canadian territories to global markets, generating wealth for both settlers and the empire. Infrastructure projects, from roads to ports to later railways, were undertaken to facilitate commerce and expand settlement. These developments reinforced the influence of British norms while integrating distant regions into a cohesive, interconnected system. Despite the pervasive influence of empire, settlers, administrators, and indigenous peoples negotiated boundaries, laws, and customs in ways that reflected both authority and local circumstances. Rebellions, petitions, and civic activism demonstrated that power was never absolute, and that communities sought to assert their agency within imperial frameworks. This interplay of control and resistance helped shape governance that was at once British in origin and uniquely Canadian in practice. Cultural life also evolved under the dual pressures of imperial influence and local development. Education, religion, and social norms reflected British models. Yet they were adapted to suit diverse communities, climates, and economies. Schools taught English language and literature, churches established traditions of worship, and civic ceremonies reinforced public order. At the same time, storytelling, oral histories, and indigenous knowledge persisted, preserving connections to land and identity that imperial structures could not erase. By the 20th century, the legacies of British rule were firmly embedded. Parliamentary institutions provided a framework for governance. Courts enforced common law, and economic systems reflected centuries of imperial organization. English and French communities coexisted within shared institutions, while indigenous nations continued to assert their rights and culture. Canada had emerged as a nation defined by both inherited structures and the ongoing negotiation of authority, identity, and belonging. The story of British rule in Canada is therefore not one of simple domination, but of enduring influence intertwined with adaptation, resistance, and continuity. It shaped laws, politics, language, and culture, while also leaving unresolved questions about land, justice, and memory. Understanding this history illuminates the foundations of modern Canada and the complex interplay between empire and local experience, revealing a nation built on authority, resilience, and the negotiation of power across centuries. By the close of the 18th century, the land of Canada was at a crossroads. The aftermath of conquest, settlement, and empire had created a complex mosaic of peoples, languages, and loyalties. In 1791, Britain made a decisive move to manage this diversity by dividing the territory into two separate colonies, Upper Canada and Lower Canada. The goal was to organize administration, ease tensions, and provide frameworks that would stabilize imperial rule, yet the effects would ripple far beyond bureaucratic convenience. Upper Canada stretched along the Great Lakes and river valleys, attracting English-speaking settlers, many of them loyalists who had fled the American Revolution. These settlers brought with them expectations of British law, institutions, and the familiar customs of home. Towns and farms expanded rapidly, connected by emerging roads and navigable waterways. Life here was defined by survival in a new land, yet it also carried a sense of continuity with the culture they had left behind. Lower Canada followed a different trajectory. Its population remained largely French-speaking, descendants of long-settled communities along the St. Lawrence River. The culture, language, and legal traditions of New France persisted despite British control. Catholic faith guided daily life and social structures. Towns retained the character of centuries-old settlements, while rural areas were organized around seigneurial holdings. Rural areas were organized around seigneurial holdings that linked land, labor, and tradition in ways familiar to the inhabitants. Each colony was granted its own legislature, a move intended to provide representation and a voice for settlers. Assemblies met in appointed chambers, debating matters of local concern, taxation, and development. On paper, these bodies suggested self-governance and civic engagement. In practice, real authority remained firmly in the hands of British-appointed officials. Governors, councils, and administrators controlled budgets, law enforcement, and land grants, often overriding local decisions. This created a tension that simmered beneath the surface of polite parliamentary procedure. Settlers quickly recognized the limits of their power. In Upper Canada, English-speaking communities desired fair access to land, transparent governance, and clarity in legal matters. In Upper Canada, English-speaking communities desired fair access to land, transparent governance, and clarity in legal matters. In Lower Canada, French-speaking populations sought protection of language, religion, and traditional rights, while also pushing for influence over the administrative machinery that dictated daily life. In Lower Canada, French-speaking populations sought protection of language, religion, and traditional rights, while also pushing for influence over the administrative machinery that dictated daily life. Across both colonies, the gap between expectation and reality fueled frustration, distrust, and debate. Across both colonies, the gap between expectation and reality fueled frustration, distrust, and debate. This dual system reflected an uneasy compromise. Britain sought to balance competing interests while maintaining overall control. It allowed for cultural preservation in Lower Canada, appeasing French-speaking populations wary of assimilation, while encouraging British-style settlement and institutions in Upper Canada. Yet this balance was fragile. Competing visions of society, authority, and rights collided with the practical demands of colonial administration. As settlements grew, so too did calls for reform. Merchants, farmers, and professionals voiced concerns over taxation, infrastructure, and representation. The assemblies became forums for grievances, petitions, and negotiation. In Lower Canada, the desire to protect language and cultural identity intersected with frustration over limited legislative influence. In Upper Canada, newcomers pressed for fair access to lands and public resources. Across the colonies, the same theme emerged: local voices were constrained, and power remained distant. Tensions were not only political but social. Settlement patterns, population growth, and migration intensified competition for resources and influence. Towns expanded with modest infrastructure, while rural areas faced disputes over boundaries, rights of passage, and access to markets. Roads, waterways, and communication lines were vital, yet often inadequate, highlighting the need for governance that could respond effectively to local needs. The years following 1791 saw a gradual awakening of political consciousness. Citizens learned to organize, debate, and advocate within the structures available to them. Newspapers, pamphlets, and public gatherings circulated ideas, creating networks of information and opinion that transcended local communities. Young professionals and settlers educated in British systems used their knowledge to press for accountability, transparency, and participation. Across both colonies, reformist energy began to take shape, even as it encountered resistance from entrenched officials. The division into Upper and Lower Canada also revealed the challenges of administering a diverse land from afar. Governors struggled to understand local conditions, enforce laws, and mediate disputes between communities with differing expectations. Policies suitable for one region often failed in another. The cultural and linguistic differences, combined with economic disparities, demanded nuanced approaches. That colonial administration was slow to deliver. Yet the framework established in 1791 set the stage for the evolution of Canadian governance. Assemblies, debates, and petitions laid the foundations of civic engagement. Settlers became accustomed to expressing grievances, negotiating with authority, and envisioning systems that reflected local priorities. The tensions and frustrations of this period would influence political movements for decades, shaping ideas about representation, justice, and autonomy. By the end of the 18th century, Upper and Lower Canada were more than geographic divisions. They were living laboratories of empire, testing the limits of colonial policy, cultural coexistence, and self-governance. Each colony carried its own identity, language, and traditions, yet both were bound by the overarching framework of British control. The seeds of reform, advocacy, and political awakening were planted, signaling that governance was not merely imposed from above but contested and redefined by those who lived within it. The story of Upper and Lower Canada in 1791 illustrates the delicate balance between imperial authority and local aspiration. It reveals the tensions inherent in creating systems that must accommodate diverse populations, differing expectations, and growing settlements. The years following the division would witness struggles, debates, and gradual change. But the foundations laid in this period shaped the path toward more representative and responsive governance in the future. Canada under British rule was a long and complex chapter. It brought institutions, borders, and political systems that still exist today. But it also brought inequality, displacement, and lasting division. Understanding this history helps explain modern Canada and its ongoing debates. Thank you for listening and for taking this journey through the past. May it inspire deeper reflection on empire, identity, and the meaning of nationhood.